Hello and welcome to Live from Paris. I'm Annette Young. It's 1 p.m. here in the French capital, so let's take a look at what's making headlines this hour. And at least 33 Turkish soldiers were killed in an airstrike by Syrian regime forces in the northwestern part of the country. As a result, Turkey is now allowing refugees to cross its borders into Greece. We'll be getting the latest shortly from our Ankara correspondent Jasper Mortimer. Also, cases of coronavirus jumped to at least 38 here in France as the outbreak continues to spread across the globe. With the head of the World Health Organization saying no country is safe, the other victims of this epidemic being the world's stock markets, who are tumbling in response to the growing anxiety. And filmmaker Roman Polanski will skip tonight's ceremony of the Césars, the French equivalent of the Oscars. This as women's groups say they will boycott the event as Polanski is facing a new rape accusation. But first to our top story, and at least 33 Turkish soldiers have been killed in an airstrike by Syrian regime forces in the northwestern part of the country. The Syrian troops are being backed by Russian forces as they try to regain the Idlib province. In response, Turkey later retaliated against Syrian government targets. As a result, the UN Secretary-General is now calling for an immediate ceasefire, and in the last few hours, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been speaking to his Turkish counterpart, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, on the phone. However, with Ankara hitting back at regime positions, the humanitarian situation is deteriorating rapidly. Peter O'Brien has the latest.
These pictures, released by the Turkish army, purport to show Syrian government targets being pummeled in Idlib province. The retaliation comes after the deadliest day for Turkish soldiers since Ankara first intervened in Syria 4 years ago.
As a result of the airstrikes, 33 soldiers have been martyred.
Russia says its air force wasn't involved in the Syrian regime's attack and blamed Turkey for stationing its troops alongside what it called terrorists. Shortly after the airstrike, a senior Turkish official said Ankara would no longer stop Syrian refugees from reaching Europe under a deal signed with the EU in 2016. This footage, released by Turkish media, shows hundreds of people moving towards the Greek border. Greece has reinforced its border patrols.
We can cross freely. The police have told us. Everyone told us that the border is open. You can go now.
Hundreds of thousands of Syrians in Idlib have been forced to flee their homes and head towards Turkey, which is already home to more than 3.5 million refugees. Seeking international support, President Erdogan had previously threatened to tear up the 2016 agreement, which had the EU provide aid in return for Turkey stopping the influx of migrants to Europe. Ankara has said, however, that few funds have materialised compared to the more than 35 billion euros it says it spent on refugees.
And let's get the latest from Jasper Mortimer in Ankara. Jasper, what is Turkey hoping to achieve by opening its borders to Greece and allowing these refugees to cross?
Well, Turkey hasn't spelled out what it wants, but I can well imagine it wants European support that is more than words. The NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said today that NATO condemns yesterday's attack on Turkey. We stand with Turkey. That won't cut it. Turkey wants military support from the Europeans and NATO. For instance, if NATO or the European members of NATO were to set up a no-fly zone over Idlib, that would stop Russian and Syrian aircraft from flying in Idlib province, it would tilt the battlefield in the favor of Turkish forces and the pro-Turkish Syrian rebels in Idlib. It would make it much easier for Turkey to drive the Syrian government forces out of Idlib, turn Idlib into a haven for Syrian opposition supporters. Those opposition supporters, and they're estimated to be more than 1 million displaced Syrian opposition supporters in Idlib, would not have to flee to Turkey, and that would relieve the refugee pressure on Turkey. And there is a precedent for such a no-fly zone. The US, Britain, and France set up a no-fly zone over the Kurdish part of northern Iraq during the years of Saddam Hussein. But I'm not sure that NATO is prepared to do this.
And what is the latest in regards to the situation on the ground in northern Syria right now?
Well, the Turkish defense minister has just said that after yesterday's attack, Turkish forces hit more than 200 Syrian government targets. There's been a lot of toing and froing on the battlefield in the past 48 hours. The pro-Turkish Syrian opposition forces have gained ground in northern Idlib. The Syrian rebels took the town of Sarakib, which is on the Aleppo to Damascus highway, thereby cutting the highway, which is a major artery, very important for the government. And I expect a major counterattack from the government forces, either later today or in the next few days. The government isn't going to allow the rebels to continue cutting that highway. On the other hand, the Syrian government forces did gain ground in southern Idlib. The attack in which they killed 33 Turkish soldiers was around a small village in the southern province. They didn't drive the Turks out of that village, though. Today, Putin and Erdogan held a phone call, as you said. According to a Kremlin statement, the two presidents agreed to take, quote, new measures to try and de-escalate the situation in Idlib. The first of these measures can be seen. Russia and Turkey will resume negotiations here in Ankara this afternoon. But, the negotiations broke off here on Tuesday afternoon without any agreement. It remains to be seen whether they will get an agreement in the negotiations about to resume.
Jasper Mortimer reporting there from Ankara. Thank you. And the other big news story of the day, and no country is safe from the coronavirus. That stark warning coming from the head of the World Health Organization as the epidemic continues to spread faster outside of China than inside. The number of cases in France leaping from 18 to 38 in just 24 hours as President Emmanuel Macron warns that an epidemic is coming. Italy remaining the European hub of that epidemic, reporting at least 650 cases and 17 deaths. And Nigeria also becoming the first country in the sub-Saharan Africa to have a case diagnosed. James Wilson reports.
Entry denied for foreign nationals who have visited Italy over the past 2 weeks. Israel is tightening restrictions after a man who had recently returned from Europe's worst-hit country tested positive for coronavirus. In Japan, Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister, called for all schools to close from the 2nd of March until upcoming spring break to help contain the virus. The World Health Organization says the epidemic has reached a decisive point, urging countries to redouble efforts to contain its spread.
No country should assume it won't get cases. That could be a fatal mistake, and quite literally. This virus has pandemic potential, and WHO is providing the tools to help every country to prepare accordingly.
Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia is stopping foreigners from entering the country for the Umrah pilgrimage. The virus has now hit at least 48 countries, with first cases newly identified in Norway, Lithuania, the Netherlands and Nigeria, the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to be impacted.
It has just been confirmed to me that there is a patient in the Netherlands infected by the coronavirus. It's a man, he's being treated in isolation in the Tweesteden Hospital in Tilburg.
Meanwhile, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights voiced concern about the widespread use of quarantine to halt the spread of the virus.
Quarantines which restrict the right to freedom of movement should be proportionate to the risk, time-bound and safe. The right of those under quarantine must be protected, including rights to food and clean water, the right to be treated humanly, access to health care, the right to be informed, and freedom of expression.
For the first time, new infections reported around the world surpassed those in mainland China, where the virus is now declining.
And schools and universities in Iraq have closed their doors to prevent the spread of the virus. This after 9 cases were recorded in the country. It's part of the government's sweeping measures amid concerns about the capacity of the country's dilapidated health system's ability to respond to the crisis. Our team on the ground sent us this report.
The Iraqi government is taking no chances. With many of its hospitals ill-equipped or in disrepair, and facing the prospect of a coronavirus pandemic, it's doubling down on Iraqis to scrupulously follow its advice.
Containing the disease and limiting the spread of this virus depends on the level of citizens' awareness of the Ministry of Health's instructions. Our measures are sufficient to limit its spread. We have very few cases, and if everyone follows our instructions, the outbreak will not spread in Iraq.
Baghdad is the Arab world's second most populous city after the Egyptian capital Cairo. But fear of the virus means its streets are now deserted. Only pharmacies are doing any business at all.
We must follow these precautions. We all have to protect our families from the virus with masks and sterilization gel.
The most important thing is personal hygiene, sterilization and hand hygiene. The second is to minimize people going to overcrowded places such as shopping malls. Hospitals have also been active in communicating the preventative measures.
Schools, universities, cinemas and cafes are all closed until March 7th. Iraq has also shut its border with Iran and banned travel to and from all the worst affected countries. The World Health Organization says Iraq has fewer than 10 doctors per 10,000 inhabitants.
To Asia now, a media tycoon and pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai has been arrested in Hong Kong for illegal assembly and intimidation. Jimmy Lai being the founder of the Apple Daily. He's accused of being involved in a banned anti-government rally last August. He's a self-made millionaire that's been bankrolling Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. Marius Sophus has more.
He's one of Hong Kong's most high-profile businessmen and an outspoken champion of the territory's pro-democracy movement. Jimmy Lai was arrested on Friday along with 2 veteran activists. They were charged with participating in an illegal march last summer and will appear in court on May the 5th. If convicted, they face up to 5 years in jail.
Earlier today, we arrested 3 local men, aged 63 to 72, for suspected participation in a non-approved gathering on the 31st of August 2019.
Lai owns the Apple Daily newspaper that is often critical of Hong Kong and Chinese leadership. The paper has claimed that on August 31st, Lai had followed a crowd along a central route for 2 hours, singing hymns and praying.
Well, the Hong Kong situation is getting tense here, but we have to go on.
It was one of the worst days of clashes in Hong Kong last year, with police firing tear gas and water cannons at pro-democracy protesters who threw petrol bombs. Authorities have arrested more than 7,000 people for their involvement in protests, many on charges of rioting that can lead to a prison sentence of up to 10 years. It's unclear how many of these people are still in custody.
And Mali's Foreign Minister is in France this Friday for a visit aimed at strengthening ties and cooperation between Paris and Bamako. The trip coming after Mali's ambassador was summoned to the French Foreign Ministry, which had expressed its indignation at the comments he made about the apparent misbehaviour of French Foreign Legion soldiers stationed in Mali. Thomas Waterhouse has more on the spat.
False, unacceptable, baseless and shocking. Those are the words chosen by French officials to describe these comments made by Mali's ambassador at the Senate on Wednesday about the excesses of French soldiers that he says he's witnessed.
In these forces, there are the officers, there's the normal army, but there are also the foreign legions, and that's where the problem lies. You see them in the red light districts of Bamako, their bodies completely covered in tattoos, behaving in a way that does not correspond to the image of the national army we know.
The ambassador is returning to Mali this Friday after having been summoned by France's foreign ministry, which voiced its fury at his remarks. Defence Minister Florence Parly, meanwhile, says that making such allegations while French service personnel are risking their lives to protect citizens is, quote, indecent. Foreign Legion troops are part of the 5,100 French soldiers stationed across the Sahel to combat Islamist insurgents. And this week's dispute comes at the tail end of a wider storm about France's military presence in that region. In January, hundreds gathered in the Malian capital in protest, with their placards reading, "France, get lost." But at talks in the Pyrenean city of Pau, just days after those rallies, President Macron secured the backing of G5 Sahel leaders to keep French boots on the ground.
Here in France, the filmmaker Roman Polanski is skipping in an awards ceremony for the French equivalent of the Oscars. This because of protests prompted by a new rape accusation levelled against the director. His latest movie, leading this year's nominations, and women's rights groups are calling for a boycott of this evening's César ceremony in the French capital. Wassim Cornet reports.
The pressure was apparently too much to handle. Despite being nominated for 12 awards at Friday's César ceremony, the French equivalent of the Academy Awards, filmmaker Roman Polanski said he would skip the event because of planned protests prompted by a new rape accusation against him. French feminist groups are also outraged that the César jury chose to nominate Polanski for a dozen awards despite the multiple accusations of sexual assault that he has faced.
Let's put things into context. It's Roman Polanski who doesn't respect the rule of law. He's always refused to face justice. He continues to be under an international arrest warrant because he escaped the US, so we're still waiting for a trial, after he admitted to sodomizing a 13-year-old girl after giving her drugs.
Polanski says he chose not to attend because activists are threatening to, quote, lynch him. The decision comes after the entire board of the French Film Academy resigned earlier this month after Polanski's film An Officer and a Spy became the favorite in this year's ceremony. But Polanski continues to benefit from support. Veteran actress Brigitte Bardot said the only thing that mattered was his work.
Luckily, Polanski is still around to save us from mediocre cinema. I judge him on his talent, not on his private life. Long live Roman!
Despite his absence at Friday's ceremony, protests by activists are expected to go ahead in front of the venue in Paris.